Another matter has come up several times in my lectures, and that is the old refrain that we have arrived at the current crisis because banks incurred risks disproportionate to their capital. We have all read this. It seems to me a commonplace. Listen, to attribute the crisis to the bad conduct of bankers is to confuse the symptoms with the causes. Granted, during the speculative euphoria stage, bankers took on disproportionate risks. But ultimately they were simply adapting their behavior to the incentives which had been established in the system. In other words, if both the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, and the European Central Bank disregard a process of passive inflationism or credit expansion, if they fail to raise interest rates when they should raise them, and if they aim for a target of 4.5% growth in the money supply, and yet impassively maintain 7% growth year after year, as occurred in Europe, or 10 or 12% growth, as occurred in the dollar area, then we cannot be surprised that, with interest rates close to zero, or even negative rates in real terms, many of the investments banks have made at the margin have been reckless or senseless. The great riskiness, or to put it more accurately in terms of economic theory, uncertainty, for risk and uncertainty are not the same thing, of such investments should not shock us. And what is absolutely outrageous is for central bankers to try to wash their hands like Pilate and attribute to banks the consequences for which the central bankers themselves are solely responsible. After all, banks are cogs in the machinery and merely responded to the incentives created by the system. Central bankers present themselves as saviors, and they hound private bankers for being greedy, for being careless, for being bad professionals who lend to people they should not have lent to, for being unscrupulous individuals who pay themselves enormous salaries, including disproportionate stock options, and so on. It is true that during the bubble or euphoria stage, and particularly following the introduction of the new international accounting standards, which I critically analyze in extenso in the preface to the second English edition of my book, Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles, the market prices of capital goods and of the securities that represent them in the stock market increased dramatically. And as a result, the balance sheets of private bankers reflect a huge amount of equity capital. Within the rules of Basel I, II, III, or whatever is in force in the future, this appearance of equity capital seems to enable bankers to use greater leverage, and everyone is delighted because everything holds up on paper. And if the capital asset pricing model indicates that what is being done is correct, then people are satisfied. But in the end, let us admit that bankers are just cogs in the machinery, who respond to incentives orchestrated by those truly responsible. Central bankers, who now throw up their hands in horror, try to look like the saviors of humanity, and condemn economic agents for merely responding to the incentives central bankers themselves created. Ultimately, the error of institutional design lies entirely in the continued existence of fractional reserve banking. In fractional reserve banking, and even in fractional reserve-free banking, individual bankers do not have a full awareness or knowledge of the scope of the process they are taking part in. Many are incapable of determining the extent to which they are creating deposits or receiving them from the competition. What portion has been saved? What portion has not been saved, and so on. They have a very incomplete microeconomic view of the perverse effects which economic theorists know the system causes on an aggregate level. In the beginning, bankers were aware of their bad conduct, and in the early days of traditional banking, they always acted in secret to avoid losing trust, especially before central banks were established. My book looks at banking in ancient Greece, in the Egypt of the Ptolemies, in ancient Rome, in both the early and the late Middle Ages, and in Seville. And from then, until the creation of central banks began at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th, bankers had to keep their activity secret, because a loss of trust meant immediate bankruptcy. A historical illustration of this phenomenon lies in the fact that whenever there has been no lender of last resort, or central bank to be always on the lookout and ready to help, the bank mortality rate has been 100% from the moment the financial crisis and economic recession have been triggered. In other words, no bank has survived. As revealed by historical analyses, for instance Bogart's analysis of banking in Greece and Chipola's studies of financial crises in the 13th, 14th and 16th centuries, The mortality rate has been 100%. However, in a normal market economy, some entrepreneurs make mistakes, while others make good decisions and prosper. Some make profits and others incur losses. But it is inconceivable for all shoemakers or all builders to suddenly go bankrupt. That happens to bankers only as a result of an expansion process in which they create money and grant loans, and resources are misallocated. It is conceivable only in a fractional reserve system that violates general legal principles. However, in the current process, to accuse bankers of bringing about the present situation is simply to look for a scapegoat, a straw man to be the target of citizens' anger.